Hello and welcome to the Daily Aus. I'm Sam.
I'm Harry.
It was Super Sunday for both the Labor Party and Coalition in the lead up to the 2025 federal election, which is now under 3 weeks away. Both camps officially launched their campaigns. Anthony Albanese did that in Perth and Peter Dutton held his in Sydney. The big focus for both? First-time homebuyers. Today, we're going to break down what these policies mean for Australians looking to enter the housing market, which we know will be predominantly young people, and how they compare to each other.
Sam, I want to start with a little bit of a question for you.
Yeah.
What's your favourite way to spend a Sunday?
It would have to be jumping on ABC iView and watching back-to-back campaign launches 3 weeks out from an election, announcing new policies we weren't sure they were going to announce.
And
the weather was
that
lovely.
Snowball effect of policy after policy just hitting us.
It's
one
fantastic.
After the other.
And there is something about an Australian political party launch that just is really exciting.
Absolutely.
Like, these are big events. There were fireworks. There were performers on stage. It was amazing. It was fantastic.
Absolutely. Well, for anyone who's unfamiliar or might have just missed a little quip there, Sam and I did spend our Sunday watching the campaign launches, looking at what the major parties were offering at this election and some of the election policies in particular for first home buyers and getting more people into the housing market. And this will come as a surprise to no one because it intersects with the cost of living and the Australian dream of home ownership. So it's really no surprise that the parties came out with this. But both Labor and the Coalition announced a raft of policies in this area. So what did we actually learn? Maybe let's start with Labor, Sam.
Yeah, and they're quite different policies, which was interesting. It was also interesting to me that it was clear that both parties were trying to distill the quite abstract, issue of economic dreaming to just helping people buy their first home as a really tangible way into this topic. And so Labor are approaching it by focusing on smaller deposits and the Coalition are focusing on tax deductions. And let's start with Labor. So it announced it wants to expand what's known as the Home Guarantee Scheme. Now, this is a scheme that has existed since 2020, but they plan to significantly expand it if they get elected
Right,
again.
because it used to be just a certain amount of spots a year, something like 50,000.
Exactly. It was a limited number of spots available for people who could basically buy a home with a 5% deposit, and the 15% that is that gap up to the 20% that banks normally need to avoid lender's insurance, that was going to be covered by the government. And so it was a way for you to have, say, $50,000 to put down on a home deposit instead of $200,000 because lender's mortgage insurance can be quite steep.
Yeah.
And so this was the Labor Party's way of bridging that gap for, as you said, like not a huge amount of young people. It was almost in some ways a bit of a test program. But under Labor's new plan from January 2026, they were going to remove that current eligibility requirement and cap, importantly the cap, opening it up to all first home buyers regardless of their income.
Right, so it's no longer a lottery. Anyone who is a first home buyer trying to crack into the market can apply for this scheme now.
Exactly. Well, almost everyone. You still need to be an Australian who's buying their first home, and you need to actually live in the property rather than rent it out as an investment. So there are still kind of those two guardrails. They're pretty broad. Now, one crucial point is that the 5% deposit can only be used for properties below a set value, and that value, the property value, will depend on where the property is. So, for example, in Sydney, the maximum property price is $1.5 million, but it's only $850,000 in Perth.
Right, and that makes sense because a house price is more expensive in Sydney or Melbourne than it is maybe in regional Queensland or the Northern Territory.
Exactly. It's like proportionate to where you're trying to buy the property.
So what's the big sell then here? Why would young people want to sign up to this scheme? What is appealing, according to the Labor Party, about this particular proposal?
Well, I think it's that lender's mortgage insurance point mixed with the Labor Party trying to show young Australians that they'll go almost, hand in hand with them to try and get a first home together. And it's aiming to lower the threshold because the point that the Labor Party makes is that in order to get a deposit, it takes, a certain number of decades longer than it would have for our parents to get their first deposit.
I was actually reading that the average deposit these days is something to the tune of $160,000.
Yeah.
And to go from a 20% deposit to a 5% deposit, it takes it down to $40,000, which is the rate that an average first home deposit was back in 2002.
Right.
Does that not bum you out just a little bit?
Well, this is the intergenerational inequality that people talk about, and it's super real. And I think what was interesting as a bigger theme over the weekend was it's clear that both parties are recognizing now that this is a thing.
Absolutely.
And we are well past the point of it being up for contention, whether it's harder for young people to crack into the housing market. It's agreed across the aisle.
And so just before we get to the other side of the aisle, maybe let's just stick with what the Labor Party were putting forward at their campaign. Did they have any other announcements that they made that were particularly targeted at young people? We talked about that snowball effect of policy after policy.
Yeah.
Was there anything else that young people in particular should know about?
Well, the big criticism for both campaigns, and I'll touch on this a bit more later, is, it helps if you help people bid for their first home, but there aren't actually enough homes for people to live in. And so they responded to that with a measure to build 100,000 affordable homes over the next 8 years, which would only be sold to first home buyers. Now, under this plan, state and territories would get $8 billion in no interest loans from the federal government, and the federal government would then chip in the other $2 billion.
I see. So trying to just boost that supply side, because if you have more people being able to put down a deposit for a first home, that increases demand.
Yeah,
so
which can
supply
put
demand.
an upward pressure on prices, right? So that's the big criticism there.
That's about as far as my economics knowledge goes. So moving right along to the coalition, what did they have to say at the campaign launch?
Well, they took a totally different approach, and they said if they win government, they're going to allow some people with mortgages to deduct their interest repayments from their income tax. And so what that means is first home buyers could deduct their mortgage interest repayments, so that's just the interest portion, not the whole repayment, from their taxable income. And that would apply to interest payments on the first $650,000 of a mortgage.
So does that mean, if I'm following along correctly, that you would end up paying less tax as a result of this policy?
Hi, I'm Ola.
And I'm Elliot.
We're the two-person team behind everything video and audio here at the Daily Aus.
If you want to help us grow so we can deliver more of the content that you love, be sure to hit subscribe.
Now let's get back to the video.
Exactly. So your taxable income would come down quite a lot because you're paying these interest payments to get a bit ahead on your mortgage. That comes off your taxable income. You end up having to owe less to the ATO. And it's kind of similar to how investment property owners can already claim interest as a tax deduction. But the big difference here is that this would now apply to people living in their own first homes. Similar to the Labor scheme, there are some eligibility requirements here as well. Those eligible would need a taxable income of under $175,000 for an individual, or a taxable income of $250,000 or under for a couple. And the scheme would be in place for 5 years. And just like the Labor government, participants must live in the home through that time.
Gotcha. So there are some guardrails in place. This wouldn't just be applicable to anyone who has interest on a mortgage.
I think both parties know that these types of schemes cost money. And so they're looking for ways to make sure it really does benefit the right people here.
So it's a targeted approach. And did the coalition give any sort of sense of how much this could save someone who was trying to crack into the market?
Well, they gave an example of a family, and a family with an average income would be $11,000 a year better off with this tax relief. So
that's not slim pickings.
No, that's a real benefit for a first home purchasing couple. According to a coalition spokesperson, their policy will cost about $1.25 billion over 4 years.
That's quite a lot of money to be spending, and we hear a lot about debts and deficits, and I'm sure that goes into some of the criticisms of these policies as well, because that is a lot of money.
Yeah.
But just sticking with housing affordability for now, what is the big contrast here?
Yeah.
What are Labor and the coalition looking to do, and what separates their visions?
And what are voters thinking about when they're going in to make a decision at the ballot box? When you've got both parties with first home buyer pitches, where's
really front and
where's
center.
the kind of difference between them? And I think The way that I would answer that would be that they're approaching the problem from very different angles. And so Labor's policy is focused on the hurdle that people experience to get a deposit. So they want to help more people get into the market sooner by reducing the upfront cost of actually putting down that deposit. But the Coalition's policy is more about the hurdle of continuing to pay for your mortgage repayments and having that ongoing affordability once you've already bought your first home. And they're doing that by reducing the tax that you would pay to help with those mortgage repayments.
As you already touched on, Sam, these are going to be big spending measures. So that's a lot of money to commit to policy areas. What have been some of the criticisms that have emerged since the campaign launches? What have we heard from the experts? What did they have to say?
Well, interestingly, the criticisms are very similar. So you've got parties that have different approaches to the topic. I'm finding that the actual critique of these policies is pretty much the same, and it's in two key areas. One is, as you rightly pointed out, just how much it's going to cost and where that money is going to come from, and all of those classic questions about kind of how do you fund these big ideas. But the second is something that we mentioned earlier as well, which is that they could very well fuel inflation and drive up house prices. If you're opening up the housing market to more people, which is a good thing, but there aren't instantly more houses for people to live in, then you end up having a bit of a demand problem. I mean, think about people who attend an auction. If they could get their deposits together under a Labor scheme, or they know they could afford their mortgage repayments easier under a coalition scheme, there'd be more people at the auction.
So, I mean, demand's going to go up, and I can tell you that even with my very basics economics understanding.
Yeah.
Surely the major parties knew that too.
Definitely, and that's why they followed up with these big infrastructure pledges. So the number of new houses they were going to build, particularly targeted at first home buyers, because they know that there's this supply problem. The problem with that is that these projects do take a bit of time. So what you end up probably happening is more people who benefit instantly from either one of these first home buyer schemes. The construction of houses will be a bit behind that.
And a lot of people listening today, Sam, are going to be renters.
Yeah.
So do we hear any proposals that are going to benefit them? Because we know that around 60% of people who are under 35 are renters.
Yeah.
This is a great cohort of people that are going to be voting at this election. Was there anything that really came out for them?
I'm really aware of that when we talk about first home buyers stuff on TDA, because even talking about the idea of getting together a 5% deposit makes a lot of assumptions about how close you are to that. And we know that there's record cost of living pressures at the moment. I guess both the Labor Party and the Coalition would say that they're helping renters out by getting that top tier of renters who are nearly ready to buy into their first homes quicker, and that should improve the number of vacancies there are, or it should ease a bit of competition. In terms of actual direct rental relief, we haven't seen directed policy on that point. It's more about the indirect tax cuts and cost of living relief, some of this first home buyer stuff. The Greens are a bit different though. They have a proper approach.
And what are the Greens saying? What are they taking to the election for renters?
Well, their big policies, and they've been in place for a while, are things like an objection to negative gearing reforms, which targets those who buy properties for investments. It's about rental caps. It's about more policies on build to rent properties. And the point that they always raise is, at the moment, a person with one investment property pays the same taxes on that investment as a person with 50 investment properties. When Greens leader Adam Bandt was asked on Sunday about the Labor and Coalition's plans, he said that neither of them will ease the cost of living and first home buyers issues, and neither of them are doing anything about rents. He did interestingly say the Greens wouldn't block Labor's policy should they win government and introduce it in the House. But he said, quote, tinkering around the edges won't be enough to stop house prices skyrocketing. He also called Peter Dutton's plan a, quote, dangerous debt trap that could push house prices into the stratosphere.
So I know we've talked a lot about housing policies, and we've really, gone deep there, Sam, and, you've done such a great job of unpacking it for our audience. But I think it's just really worth noting that there was also a big tax announcement at the campaign launches. So Labor is going to allow you to take $1,000 of deductions off your taxable income.
For work-related expenses.
For work-related expenses with no receipts.
No receipts.
So no fuel gauges that you need to monitor, no collecting a receipt at the supermarket. You can just that's $1,000.
Right.
Got to tick the box.
Yeah.
And then you also had the coalition propose a fairly similar scheme. It's a $1,200 one-off tax cut for people who are earning between $48,000 and $104,000 a year, and then a slightly smaller tax cut that we don't really know the amount of for people who are earning slightly under that and slightly above that threshold.
And it's interesting to note that these measures were all announced together. So you had the first home buyers stuff, you had the housing supply stuff, and then you had these tax relief measures. And I think that does go to the big balance here in this campaign overall. And that's both camps are trying to give people a bit of a short-term sugar hit for cost of living relief and put some money back in pockets, but also show that they have the long-term solutions to tackle some of these more entrenched issues.
And I think it's worth remembering that this is the first election that Gen Z and millennials are going to outnumber older generations.
Definitely. Never been more important time to work in youth media, Harry.
Exactly. And I also think that that is really feeding into the way that both parties are approaching this campaign now. They are really targeting that central group of people who are feeling a little bit less optimistic about their prospects of buying a home, and with cost of living, younger people hit hardest in that way. And of course, we'll be unpacking all the big things that matter to young voters, and we'll be keeping a track of everything happening in this campaign and making sure it all makes sense. I think that's the big thing that everyone needs from this election. Thank you so much for joining the Daily Aus. We'll be back in your ears a little later today with the afternoon headlines. But until then, have a great day.